Did African empires practice slavery? It's a question that lingers in classrooms, debates, and dinner table conversations. A question often answered with sweeping certainty, yet rarely with the care history demands. For many, the word slavery immediately conjures the horrific images of the transatlantic slave trade. Human beings shackled in chains, packed into dark, airless ships. Bodies and identities stripped away, generations condemned to a life of brutal labor with no hope of freedom. But this was not the only form of slavery to exist in history. And it was certainly not the only way labor and servitude were organized in the world's great civilizations. Before Europeans set sail to Africa's shores, the continent was home to empires whose names still echo through time. Mali, Songhai, Benin, Asante, Great Zimbabwe, Kanem-Bornu. These were kingdoms of gold, salt, art, scholarship, and trade, their capitals alive with markets and diplomacy, their courts steeped in ceremony and law. Yet within their walls, there were also people in service to others. Some worked to pay off debts. Some had been taken in war. Some were pledged by their families to forge alliances or survive famine. And here lies the problem with our modern conversation. We take one definition of slavery, the Western, colonial, chattel slavery that devastated millions, and we apply it indiscriminately to every historical society. This is where truth gets blurred. If we are to understand African history on its own terms, we must step away from the assumption that all forms of servitude were the same. We must enter a world where labor, loyalty, and social bonds often intertwined, and where freedom was not always lost forever. On one side, the Western model, chattel slavery, where a person is not a person at all but property. This system was hereditary, inescapable, and built on dehumanization. On the other, the varied African systems, debt bondage, pawnship, judicial servitude, tribute labor, where in many cases a person could marry, own property, rise in social rank, or even become a leader. Were these systems always fair? No. Did some people suffer terribly? Yes. But they were not identical to the racialized, generational slavery that would come with the European empires. Amid the noise and life, there are workers, some free merchants, others servants, others bound by obligations that stretch beyond a single lifetime. Yet the lines between them are blurred. When we speak of slavery in Africa before European domination, we must be clear. The word meant different things in different places. Across the continent, the systems of labor and servitude were as varied as the landscapes themselves. In many African societies, a debt could be repaid not in coin but in time. A person, or a family member, would work for a creditor until the obligation was cleared. In the Mali Empire, this was sometimes voluntary, especially in times of famine, when entering a wealthy household could mean survival. Once the debt was paid, freedom was restored, and often ties of loyalty remained between former creditor and worker. Pawnship was a form of security in trade and diplomacy. Imagine, a merchant from a distant village wants to borrow gold dust for trade. In return, he offers his own nephew to live with the lender's family until the debt is settled. The nephew is treated not as a prisoner, but as part of the household, sometimes even given education or training in a craft. In the Asante kingdom, pawnship was common among elites. It was not always benevolent, abuse could occur, but it was not intended to be permanent. Once the debt was cleared, the pledged person returned home. Conquest had its own system of labor. In empires like Benin and Kanem-Bornu, conquered territories sent people as tribute. Some served in royal households. Others worked on public projects or became soldiers. In many cases, captives were absorbed into the culture of their new home, adopting its language, customs, and even religion. Within a generation, their children could be indistinguishable from the native population. Crime in pre-colonial Africa often carried financial penalties. If a thief could not repay what was stolen, they might serve the injured party for a set period. In Songhai, such servitude could be shortened if the offender's family paid compensation. The goal was restoration, not permanent exile from society. Once the service ended, the person could resume life as a free member of the community. What makes these systems remarkable is their fluidity. Unlike the rigid chattel slavery of the Americas, African servitude often allowed for marriage into the host family, property ownership while in service, social mobility, sometimes rising to positions of leadership. The Ethiopian chronicles tell of war captives who became generals, and Swahili coast records show freed servants becoming wealthy merchants. These systems were far from perfect. There were cases of cruelty, betrayal, and abuse. But they were also embedded in a moral framework, one that saw people as part of a social web, not just as commodities. This, more than anything else, marks the difference from the system that would soon arrive from across the Atlantic. A system that stripped away all humanity, leaving only profit and loss. In the African kingdoms and empires of the past, there was no single path into servitude. It was not a one-size-fits-all fate. The why mattered. The how mattered. And the outcome could be radically different depending on where you lived, who you served, and why you were there in the first place. In the Asante Empire, wars were fought not just for territory but for prestige, resources, and sometimes people. Those captured might be brought back to the capital, Kumasi, where their future varied. Some became domestic servants. Others were trained as soldiers, warriors whose loyalty could be earned through honor, reward, and integration into Asante society. There are recorded cases where former captives rose so high that they commanded armies themselves, their former status forgotten. In the Songhai Empire, a thief who could not repay what he had stolen might serve the victim for a fixed period. The punishment was intended to restore balance, not destroy the offender's life. During service, such individuals might still own personal possessions, marry, or farm their own small plot. When their term ended, they rejoined society without stigma, a stark contrast to the lifetime brand of slavery in the Americas. Famine and drought could push families into impossible choices. In Great Zimbabwe, when crops failed, it was not unheard of for a family to place a child or relative into another household for safekeeping, in exchange for food and security. This was not considered a disgrace. The person in service might be trained in skills or crafts, becoming more valuable to their own family when they returned. In parts of the Hausa city-states and Benin Kingdom, children of noble families were sometimes sent to live with allied rulers as a pledge of loyalty. These hostages were treated with respect, often raised alongside royal children, learning court etiquette, language, and politics. Far from being prisoners in the Western sense, they could return home as diplomats, commanders, or even heirs. In most of these systems, servitude was not automatically passed to children. A war captive's son could grow up free. A debtor's daughter could marry into her host family. Even in harsher cases, there were doors, narrow yes but real, through which a person could walk back to freedom. But everything changed when Europeans arrived. The rules, the customs, the exit routes, all of it would be twisted, weaponized, and swallowed into a trade that cared for neither law nor humanity. For centuries, African labor systems operated according to their own rules. They were embedded in cultural, legal, and moral frameworks, flawed, sometimes harsh, but rarely designed to strip a person of humanity forever. In the mid-15th century, Portuguese caravels landed on the shores of Senegambia. At first, trade meant gold, ivory, pepper, and textiles. But soon the most profitable cargo was human. Europeans didn't create the idea of servitude in Africa, but they saw existing systems and re-engineered them to serve a far more brutal purpose. Before European intervention, most African servitude was local. A war captive became part of the victor's community, or a debtor served within the same region. Europeans brought something new: permanent, hereditary slavery. The concept of people as commodities for distant markets. A racial ideology to justify the trade. Where African systems often allowed freedom after a term, European traders demanded bodies that would never be freed, whose children and grandchildren would be born into chains. In Benin, the Oba king initially resisted selling captives to the Portuguese, preferring to trade in goods. But the profits were staggering. European merchants brought firearms, luxury goods, and wealth in exchange for people. Some rulers refused entirely. Others, pressured by rival kingdoms armed by Europeans, joined the trade for survival. The balance of power shifted violently. Wars were fought not for territory but for captives to sell. Where once captives might have been taken for integration, now raids were organized specifically to capture people for European ships. Villages that had coexisted for generations were turned into hunting grounds. The trade created a vicious cycle. Guns bought with human lives were used to take more lives, to buy more guns. The pathways to freedom that once existed, debt repayment, marriage, adoption into the host community, collapsed under the new demand. Once sold to European traders, there was no coming back. No local court could intervene. No family could ransom you home. And the scale was unprecedented. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. Millions more died in capture, transit, or holding pens along the coast. The systems that had once been woven into the fabric of African societies were torn apart and rewoven into a global economy of human misery, one that enriched European empires and devastated African communities. But even in this darkness, there were voices that resisted: rulers, warriors, and everyday people who refused to feed the European trade. For too long, the story of African servitude has been told about Africa, not from Africa. But the continent left its own records. Chroniclers, travelers, and griots preserved what they saw. And their words tell a different story than the one repeated in colonial textbooks. In the 17th century, the historian Mahmoud Kadi wrote of the Songhai Empire's justice system. When a man takes another in war, he explained, he may keep him in service, but the law does not make him less than a man. He may marry, own property, and his children are his own. This is a direct challenge to the Western idea of slave as pure property. In Songhai, even captives retained humanity and legal recognition. In the late 15th century, the Oba of Benin reportedly told Portuguese traders, "We have no desire to sell our people. We trade in ivory, pepper, and cloth. You should seek your slaves elsewhere." Though Benin would later join the trade under pressure, this early resistance is a reminder that African leaders understood the danger of what was being proposed. In the 18th century, the Fulani scholar Abdullahi Dan Fodio wrote against the kidnapping of free Muslims to sell into slavery, calling it a great sin and a corruption upon the land. This was more than moral outrage. It was a theological argument rooted in Islamic law that many West African societies respected. Even some early Europeans noticed the difference. A Portuguese trader in the 1500s describing the Jollof kingdom in Senegambia noted that slaves there could own livestock, farm their own land, and even have slaves of their own, a social reality far removed from the plantation slavery Portugal was developing in the Americas. But these observations often got lost, or deliberately ignored, in favor of a simpler, more profitable narrative, that all African servitude was the same as European slavery, and thus fair game for expansion. Across the continent, resistance flared, sometimes armed, sometimes diplomatic. The Nzinga Bandi of Ndongo and Matamba negotiated, fought, and shifted alliances to protect her people from Portuguese slave raiders. In the Gold Coast, some Fanti chiefs refused to sell certain captives, especially women and children, for export. The communities in the Bight of Biafra built hidden settlements deep in forests to escape coastal raiding. These were not passive victims of an unstoppable tide. Africans debated, resisted, and often tried to control the terms of engagement. But the European hunger for labor, fueled by the plantations of the Americas, was relentless. Soon, even the meaning of slave in Africa would be rewritten entirely. For centuries, the story of Africa's past has been told by others, often by those with something to gain. They have drawn Africa as a blank canvas, onto which they painted their own image of civilization, morality, and history. And in their telling, Africa before Europe was either a paradise untouched by hardship, or a barbaric wasteland in need of salvation. Both are lies. The truth, as we have seen, is complex. African empires did have systems of servitude, but these were not mere shadows of European chattel slavery. They were woven into the fabric of society, often fluid, often offering paths to freedom, integration, even honor. They were not perfect, but they were profoundly different from the dehumanizing, hereditary bondage that would later be forced upon the continent. Colonial powers had every reason to erase this nuance. By portraying African servitude as identical to their own transatlantic trade, they justified their crimes. They were selling each other already, the apologists would say, as if that excused the horrors of the Middle Passage, the whips, the chains, the generations stolen without hope of freedom. But this erasure has a cost far beyond the pages of history books. It has seeped into our collective memory, shaping how descendants of Africa see themselves, and how the world sees them. Reclaiming the narrative means doing more than correcting facts. It means restoring dignity to ancestors whose lives were complex, whose choices were made in the context of their own time. It means recognizing that African societies had agency. They were not passive, helpless victims in history, nor were they monstrous villains. They were human. A reenactment of an Asante court scene, where a debt servant is released after repayment. An artisan in Timbuktu teaching his craft to an apprentice who once came as a war captive. A village in Mali celebrating the return of a relative from servitude. History without nuance is a weapon. And for too long that weapon has been pointed at Africa. But the archives are opening. Oral histories are being recorded. The griots are speaking again. This is not about denying that wrongs were done within Africa. It is about understanding them in their true proportions, and refusing to let those wrongs be twisted into excuses for far greater atrocities. When we tell the truth, the whole truth, Africa is no longer the shadow of someone else's history. It stands in its own light, a continent of empires, of trade and scholarship, of faith and law, of struggle and resilience. And perhaps, in knowing this, we can begin to break the chains that still remain, the chains not on our bodies but on our minds. History is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. And for too long, Africa's story has been told by voices that never lived it. The kingdoms, the faiths, the heroes, the rebellions, they have been hidden under layers of colonial rewriting, distorted in classrooms, and buried in the footnotes of someone else's history book. But here's the truth. Africa has never been a passive spectator in the human story. We were builders when the rest of the world was learning to farm. We were philosophers when empires elsewhere were still searching for words. We were healers, scientists, sailors, astronomers, and prophets, long before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. Now, in this moment, we stand at a crossroad. We can either let our history continue to be stolen in silence, or we can reclaim it. We can pass it down not just as fragments of memory but as a living inheritance, to our children, our communities, and the world. Every time you share this knowledge, every time you teach someone the truth about Africa, you chip away at centuries of lies. So if you believe our ancestors deserve to be remembered, if you believe their achievements deserve to be celebrated and not erased, then be part of this movement. Like this video, share it widely, and join us in building a library of truth that no colonizer, no empire, and no false narrative can ever burn again. The past is not dead. It is alive. And it is calling you to rise.